Most people wait for a narcissist's karma as if waiting for a verdict. They believe that one day that person will lose you, lose the new partner, lose their image, and suffer the way you once did. But if you look closely, you will notice a cold paradox. A narcissist does not collapse when you suffer. They begin to collapse when you are at peace, not when you leave in tears, but when you leave without needing to prove anything, without needing to be understood, without needing them to realize anything at all. From a Jungian perspective, karma is not an external punishment. Karma is the moment when a psychological structure can no longer operate the way it used to because it has lost its support. A narcissist exists through a very fragile system. They cannot self-regulate their emotions, cannot sustain a sense of worth on their own, and therefore must borrow other people as psychological scaffolding. You were not only someone they loved, you were the anchor that kept them from sinking into emptiness. As long as you reacted, explained, and were hurt, that system kept running. But at some point, you fall silent. Not silence as punishment, but silence because you are exhausted. You no longer want to prove you are right, no longer want to fix them, no longer want recognition. And that moment is the most dangerous moment for a narcissist. Because this is when they do not lose you, they lose your function in their inner world. Karma begins very quietly. No thunder, just nights of unnamed anxiety, waves of emptiness that the new person cannot reach. Moments when they realize that even though people are still around them, no one is holding together the feeling of, I am okay. The shadow they once projected onto you, shame, helplessness, the sense of not being enough begins to return. And this time, there is no one left to carry it for them. That is why they want to come back. Not because love awakens too late, not because conscience suddenly appears, but because the memory of you is tied to a state they can no longer generate on their own. The feeling of being regulated, of existing, of being reflected. Understanding this is the moment you stop asking, why did they come back? And begin to understand why you should not go back anymore. If there is one thing that must be stated clearly, it is this. A narcissist's karma does not begin when they lose you. It begins when they can no longer use you. Losing a person has never been the fatal blow for them. What fractures their system is the loss of a psychological function, a function you had been silently performing on their behalf for a very long time. There are people who cannot generate a sense of stability, worth, and existence from within. They require an external anchor in order to function. For a narcissist, that anchor is not achievement or status, but the emotional reactions of others. Your gaze, your pain, your repeated attempts to explain, endure, and hope, all of it becomes the energy that allows their persona to stand upright in the world. In that relationship, you were not simply loving them, you were preventing them from falling into inner emptiness. Every time you reacted, whether through tears or anger, you were helping them avoid facing themselves. That is why they could continue to hurt others and still go on living, performing, and believing they were fine. Not because they were strong, but because someone else was carrying the shadow they could not bear. Karma, in the Jungian sense, is not punishment. Karma is restitution. It is the moment when energy that was pushed outward returns to its rightful owner. When you leave while still angry, still in pain, still hoping they will understand, still waiting for an apology psychologically, you are still present. The system has not collapsed, but when you truly withdraw, when your silence is not a tactic but exhaustion, when you no longer want to prove anything at all, that is when karma begins to operate. Quietly, without drama, simply because there is no one left to regulate them. And the first reaction of an unregulated system is not awakening, but survival panic. Everything that was once projected onto you, shame, insecurity, worthlessness, The fear of being seen begins to rebound inward. The persona still exists, but it must perform harder to cover an emptiness that is growing deeper by the day. The new person cannot hold it, because they were never an emotional pillar the way you were. Busyness cannot fill it, because this emptiness does not come from a lack of stimulation, but from a lack of inner structure. It is precisely at this stage that the desire to return emerges, not because love has been revived, but because the system is oxygen deprived. The memory of you resurfaces not as a person, but as a state in which they once felt okay, solid, real. Their brain binds that state to your image. They call it missing you. They call it regret. But at a deeper level, it is a reflexive search for shelter. This is the point that must be faced directly without avoidance. A narcissist does not return to confront the truth. They return to escape it. They seek you not because they want accountability, but because your silence has exposed what they fear most, that without reflection, they do not know who they are. If you react, if you open the door, if you explain, the system is instantly powered back on. The shadow has somewhere to hide again. The persona can keep breathing. That is why your calm becomes the strongest form of karma. Not because it makes them suffer the way you once suffered, but because it gives them nothing to cling to. No data, no feedback, no role, only themselves facing themselves. When you understand this, you stop confusing their return with your worth. You see clearly. Their desire to come back is not evidence of love, but evidence of a dependency you have already exited. And once you are no longer standing in that former position, their karma continues to unfold without your presence and without the power to pull you back into the old cycle. At this point, a very natural question arises. If they are in pain, empty and unstable, doesn't that mean regret? The answer, however difficult to accept, is no, because between suffering and remorse lies a vast psychological distance, and narcissists almost never cross it. From Carl Jung's perspective, genuine remorse appears only when a person can endure shame without projecting it. That means they must see their own shadow, acknowledge their role in the harm they caused, and remain with that awareness long enough for it to be integrated. For a narcissist, however, shame is not an emotion, it is a threat to survival. And for that reason, every return occurs before that confrontation, not after it. When they reappear, the driving force is not a desire to repair, but a need to escape the instability that has just surfaced. They seek you the way someone seeks oxygen while suffocating, not to learn how to breathe, but to stop the panic. That is why apologies, if they appear at all, are usually vague. No specifics, no concrete responsibility, no deep understanding of what actually happened. Only words soft enough to open the door, emotions strong enough to activate memory, and just enough ambiguity to avoid the truth. And here, the old cycle begins to reveal itself. If you react, whether with hope, anger, or compassion, the system is immediately reactivated. Their persona regains its reflection. The shadow finds shelter again. The state of instability softens. And precisely because of that, the motivation to change disappears the moment they feel okay again. Not because they are deliberately deceiving you, but because their entire psychological structure is designed to avoid integration, avoid endurance, avoid staying with the truth. This is the deeper reason every return ends the same way, no matter how different it appears on the surface. It begins with gentleness, then comes boundary testing, and gradually the old mechanisms return: control, manipulation, projection, reversal of responsibility. Not because they have become bad again, but because they never left that structure in the first place. Without shadow integration, there is no transformation, only repetition. And at this point, another truth begins to surface, not about them, but about you. This return fails not only because they have not changed, but because you are no longer standing in the old position. You no longer react the way you once did. You no longer over-explain. You no longer try to make them understand. Your presence, if it remains at all, carries a different quality now. More aware, more distant, less engaged. That disorients them, because they can no longer find the version of you that once kept them regulated. And it is precisely this misalignment that exposes the true nature of their desire to return. It is not the search for a new relationship, but the attempt to reclaim an old role, a role you have refused to continue playing. When that role is gone, the return loses its purpose. Not because you are cold, but because you are no longer the place where the old system can operate. At this point, karma continues its work, not by making them cling harder, but by ensuring that every path back leads to failure. There is no way to restore the former balance, no one left to carry the shadow for them. And for the first time, they are forced to face an uncomfortable truth. The problem was never that you left it, is that they cannot exist without using you. According to Carl Jung, the greatest form of power does not lie in confrontation, but in the withdrawal of psychological libido, the withdrawal of life energy that once sustained a structure. When you no longer react, no longer explain, no longer feel internally shaken by their presence, you do not win in the conventional sense. You stop participating, and for a system that lives off the reactions of others, non-participation is the point of collapse. This must be stated clearly. Your peace is not a moral stance, nor a lofty spiritual choice. It is the result of reclaiming yourself. You no longer carry a shadow that does not belong to you. You no longer regulate another person's emotions. You stand in a state they cannot manipulate, because there is nothing to grasp, nothing to pull, nothing to activate. And that is what delivers the final blow. When they approach and receive none of the familiar responses, their persona loses orientation. Words that once worked now dissolve into empty space. Strategies that once opened doors now meet silence. There is no anger to provoke, no compassion to exploit, no hope to feed illusion. Only a very clear distance, not cold, not hostile, that cannot be crossed. This is the moment karma completes its cycle. Not through dramatic collapse, but through prolonged impotence. They realize there is no way back to the old position, no one left to carry the shadow for them. No version of you left to borrow as shelter. And for the first time, they must live with a truth that cannot be projected away. This emptiness is theirs. The most important thing here, and what you need to hear, is this. This karma does not require your witness. It does not need you to stay and see their regret, does not need you present for them to recognize their fault, does not need you to maintain a bond to achieve proper closure. Completion occurred the moment you are no longer pulled out of yourself, when your peace is no longer a reaction, but a natural state. You have stepped out of the loop. And on the other side of that loop, karma is no longer their story. It becomes a quiet but decisive marker. You are no longer the place they return to, and no longer the person who needs them to disappear in order to be free. After karma completes its work, the most important thing to understand correctly is this. For the narcissist, no truly new chapter begins. There is no quiet rebirth, no natural maturation simply because they lost you. What follows is not recovery, but prolonged entrapment in a psychological structure that has lost the capacity to evolve. On the outside, they continue living, connecting, forming new relationships. Inside, movement has stopped. What remains is inertia. In Jung's depth psychology, a person only truly changes when they can remain with inner conflict long enough for it to be integrated. For narcissists, this almost never happens naturally, because the entire system is built to avoid staying, avoid enduring, avoid looking directly. When you are no longer there to carry the shadow for them, they do not move into a new phase, they freeze at the point of rupture. As a result, what often comes first is constant replacement. But this replacement does not signify a beginning. It is a desperate attempt to preserve the old structure. The new person does not meet someone opening up, but steps into a pre-shaped void. Everything may look different on the surface, but the internal operating logic remains unchanged. Rapid idealization, accelerated bonding, demands for reaction, and gradual re-establishment of control. Not because they do not remember you, but because they do not know how to exist without someone regulating them. Alongside replacement comes narrative rewriting. When you no longer occupy the old position, they must hold you in an edited version. You may become too sensitive, unable to understand them, someone who left at the wrong time. Not to smear you, but to preserve their ego. Because if the truth remained intact, they would have to face what is unbearable, that they destroyed the only thing that ever stabilized them. Rewriting the story allows them to survive without collapsing, but the price is increasing distance from the truth, and with that distance, the possibility of change closes further. At a deeper level, after karma completes its cycle, many narcissists do not disappear entirely from your life. They do not hoover loudly or seek direct contact, but continue to observe from a distance, not out of love, but because you have become an internal reference point that cannot be erased. Your peace, if it exists, poses a dangerous question they cannot answer. If you can continue living without them, what was actually wrong? That question is never confronted. It is only suppressed. And that suppression increases foundational instability. Over time, this continuous avoidance leads to another state: emotional exhaustion. A system that must constantly perform, constantly control, constantly deny will wear down. Not always through dramatic collapse, but through gradual depletion, faster boredom, irritability, and greater dependence on external stimulation to feel alive. Yet none of that stimulation nourishes them from within. It only prolongs avoidance, and with each successful avoidance, their capacity to endure the truth weakens further. In the end, after karma completes its work, only two possibilities remain, and neither involves you. The rare possibility is genuine confrontation, accepting emptiness, enduring shame, entering deep therapy, and relinquishing control. If this happens, it does not begin by returning to you, but by abandoning the entire old system. Rare but possible. The more common outcome is continued life in a frozen state, replacing people, changing settings, rewriting stories, but not evolving. Time passes, while they remain standing still within the same structure, with less and less energy to maintain it. And this is the central point of this entire section. A narcissist's karma is not something you need to witness, wait for, or validate. It operates once you have exited the loop, and it continues without your presence. You are not their final chapter, and they are not yours. The two paths diverged the moment you stopped carrying a shadow that was never yours. One path continues revolving around avoidance, the other begins learning how to remain with oneself, difficult, empty, but real. And there, karma is no longer a story of punishment, but a very clear boundary. Only the person who takes responsibility for their inner life is truly alive. At this point, what needs to be set right is not the fate of the narcissist, but the end point of the journey where you now stand. Because the moment karma completes its work does not arrive in the form of victory, nor does it come with the satisfaction of watching someone else pay a price. It arrives as a deep settling, where you realize that this story no longer needs an opponent. No one has to collapse for you to be at peace. No one has to admit anything for you to trust the truth you have lived. From Carl Jung's perspective, psychological maturity does not occur when the ego is glorified, but when energy once trapped in conflict is retrieved and returned to the center. In narcissistic relationships, much of your energy was pulled outward to react, to endure, to explain, to hope, to keep a structure alive that could not stand on its own. When you withdraw that energy, you do not weaken them. You restore your own wholeness. And it is precisely here that another truth emerges, very quiet, yet completely decisive. You no longer want them to come back. Not because you are angry, not because you despise them, but because your nervous system no longer registers them as a false center of safety. The things that once unsettled you, late messages, old memories, familiar looks, no longer hold power. Not because you are trying to be strong, but because your inner structure has changed. This is where the story truly ends. Not in whether they return or not, but in the fact that even if they do appear, you are no longer pulled out of yourself. There is no need to prove anything, no urge to repair, no lingering what if. Those questions existed because you were standing inside a structure that had not yet closed. When that structure closes from within, the questions dissolve on their own. This is often accompanied by a very strange feeling, empty but not hollow, quiet but not numb, a space where you no longer have to play any role for anyone, no longer have to regulate another person's emotions. And within that space, you begin to hear your own voice again, not a reactive voice, but a choosing one. You are no longer living to avoid pain, but begin living from a clear boundary between what belongs to you and what does not. From the outside, nothing dramatic happens. No farewell ceremony, no final words. But psychologically, this is a complete closure, a place where you no longer need additional proof to know you were right, no extra story to retell, no witnesses. Silence at this point is no longer a defense, it is living space. And for that reason, this story does not end with you overcoming the narcissist. It ends with you no longer revolving around them. You return to your own axis, where any future relationships, if they arise, are no longer built on carrying, absorbing, or sacrificing yourself to keep someone else from collapsing. Love, if it returns, will not require a savior role. It will require presence with boundaries. When you look back from this position, you can see clearly karma finished its work long ago, not through punishment, but through the severing of dependency. What remains is not waiting, but living. And living, this time, is not a reaction. It is a conscious choice. There is a moment that is very difficult to describe and rarely spoken about. It is not the moment you understand everything, not the moment you forgive, not even the moment you stop thinking about them. It is the moment you stop viewing this story as a lesson about them and begin to realize it was always a journey about yourself. From Carl Jung's perspective, every obsessive relationship is an expression of an unrecognized inner conflict. The narcissist did not enter your life by accident. They touched the exact place where you once learned to love through sacrifice, where you believed endurance was a form of loyalty, where you confused attachment with the loss of self. When that relationship ends, what truly comes into question is not what they did, but where you left yourself behind. The final stage of the journey is not labeling them with sharper psychological terms, nor retelling the story with more refined arguments. The final stage is the moment you no longer need that story to define who you are. You no longer see yourself as the one who was hurt, the one who endured, or the one who overcame. Those identities were once necessary to help you stand again, but if held too long, they become another form of confinement. Here, a very subtle shift occurs. You begin to recognize that what prolonged that relationship was not only their manipulation, but also your unconscious loyalty to an old role, the role of the one who endures well, the one who understands deeply, the one who always stays a little longer, waits for one more sign, hopes one more time. When that role is seen without judgment, without self-blame, it begins to dissolve. And with it, dissolves the urge to prove, to fully understand, or to end things properly. I am saying this marks a form of maturity very different from what is commonly called strength. You do not become harder. You become clearer. Clear about where you end and where another begins. Clear that you do not need to remain in any relationship that requires you to trade away your own presence. Clear that love is not a test of endurance, and peace is not a reward for those who sacrifice enough. And when that clarity stabilizes, something crucial happens. The narcissist loses their central position in your psychological life. Not because they are erased, but because they are no longer a reference point. They become a bounded memory, no longer spilling into the present. A chapter that has closed not because you shut it, but because you stepped into another chapter without needing to carry it forward. At the deepest level, this is where the loop ends. Not their loop, but yours. The loop of loving while forgetting yourself, of saving others while leaving yourself behind, of enduring in the hope of being seen. When this loop stops, all old structures lose their pull automatically. No confrontation needed, no further explanation required, no additional lesson necessary. And at this endpoint, karma is no longer an outward-facing concept. It becomes a quiet inner reordering. Each person returns to carrying their own inner life. You do not carry theirs. They no longer carry yours. Two life paths diverge without hatred, without entanglement, without the need for final words. If there is one thing worth holding on to from this entire journey, it is not knowledge about narcissism, nor heightened vigilance toward future relationships. It is the ability to remain with yourself without a role. When you have that capacity, you no longer fear encountering this type of person again, not because you have learned how to avoid them, but because you are no longer the ground in which that structure can take root. At the end of this journey, perhaps the most important thing no longer lies in how the narcissist has changed, whether they return or not, or whether they remain trapped in their own cycle. What matters most is where you are standing as you look back at everything, because if you look deeply enough, you will realize this. Karma was never created to punish anyone. It exists to return everything to its rightful place. From Carl Jung's perspective, what causes human suffering is not the shadow itself, but the act of carrying parts that do not belong to us. While you were in that relationship, you carried things on their behalf, their emotions, their shame, their instability, and even the illusion that love could keep an unhealthy structure standing. When you withdraw from that role, you do not destroy them, you end the act of caring for them. And that is precisely the moment karma completes its work. Not through dramatic collapse, but through a silence with no remaining lines attached. Not by making them realize how valuable you were, but by bringing you to a place where you no longer need them to realize it. When your absence is no longer a message being sent, but the natural state of having returned to yourself, all old cycles lose their reason to continue. If there is anything worth carrying forward after all of this, it is not extreme vigilance, nor the fear of repeating the past. It is a clear, grounded understanding. Love does not require you to disappear, and peace does not have to be earned through pain. When you hold that understanding, you do not merely close a relationship, you close an old way of living. At its deepest level, karma is not about what will happen to them. Karma is the moment you are no longer pulled away from your own axis. And when that happens, this story, no matter how long, painful, or complex, has completed its task. What remains is not to understand more, but to continue living this time within an inner life that is no longer borrowed, no longer occupied, and no longer traded away.